magically, or a Bible or some other religious object and saying, even though I might be disobedient to God, as long as I have this religious object, everything is going to work out well for me. So yes, the ark was a sacred object of God's presence. But they get in our mind, in spite of my spiritual condition, if the ark goes out to battle, we'll be victorious. What an empty hope that was. Thinking somehow if you have some religious symbol, in spite of the lack of faith and obedience in your heart, that you will be successful because you got God in a box and you got God with us. Well, they're massacred in a battle. And Hophni and Phinehas, these two depraved priests' sons, they're killed in the battle as well. And when Eli hears about it, hears about the Ark of the Covenant taken captive by the Philistines, he falls over backwards and he dies. He was heavy and he died falling over at that point. Well, can God fend for himself? The Ark is taken into Philistine territory. There's no Israelites that can do any kind of battle. Can God fend for himself? Sometimes we question that. Somehow we think, I've got to do it for him. I've got to do something in God's behalf, and maybe we can cover for God as though he's too weak to handle situations by himself. So the ark goes down into Philistine territory, and the Philistines take it to Ashdod, one of their 5 main cities, and they put the ark in the house of Dagon. That was a grain god, one of their chief god, a grain god, again, looking for fertility from grain with their god Dagon. And so it says here, when the Asherites got up early the next morning in their temple, Dagon had fallen on his face to the ground before the ark of the Lord. And so they have to set him back upright again. And then the next day, they got up the next day, and behold, Dagon had fallen on his face to the ground before the ark of the Lord. And the head of Dagon and both his palms of his hands were cut off on the threshold. God can fend for himself. And then in Ashdod, God strikes them, verse 6, with many tumors. The hand of the Lord was heavy on the Ashdodites, and he made them feel devastated and struck them with tumors. Well, let's get it out of Ashdod. They figure let's send it on to Gath. More tumors of judgments from God on Gath as well. And so God is sending the message loud and clear. His people were out of fellowship with him. That's why the Philistines were able to conquer his people, but not God himself. And there is no God that can stand before the true God, and there are no people that can successfully resist the true God as well. So they get the message loud and clear, and so they return the ark quickly done as these tumors are breaking out all over the Philistines, and they know it's from the Lord. They return the ark back to the Israelites again. And then there's this 20 years of mourning after the Lord in chapter 7, verse 2. But they've got a priest and a prophet. They got one who's receiving the word of the Lord and giving it forth, putting them in a better spiritual condition. So Samuel becomes very prominent in leading to a revival for the nation. You want to know what revival looks like? Here's a good description. In chapter 7, verses 3 to 5, Samuel spoke to all the house of Israel, if you are returning to the Lord with all your heart, then remove the foreign gods and the Asherah, that wife of Baal, from among you, and direct your heart to the Lord and serve him alone. And he will save you from the hand of the Philistines. So the sons of Israel remove the Baals and the Asheroth and serve the Lord alone. The problem is we serve the Lord along with a bunch of other gods and things that we think will satisfy. No, true revival is breaking from all those other gods that we're trying to find satisfaction in. Serve the Lord alone. And meanwhile, this priest is committed to pray for them as well. Gather all the people at Mizpah, and I will pray to the Lord to you there. If we move in this direction, we have ourselves in a position where that is conducive for revival. And that's where we need to be spiritually, and that's where Samuel has been very strategically getting them to that point. Well, Samuel grows old like everybody else does. And he tries to get his sons to act as judges, but it doesn't work very well. Chapter 8, verse 1, Samuel is old, and he had appointed his sons, but verse 3 says they didn't walk in his ways. Must have been a heartache as a father to see his own sons not walking like he did. They turned aside to dishonest gain. They took bribes and perverted justice. So the elders of Israel gather together, and they've got this idea again. They say to Samuel in verse 5, "Behold, you have grown old. Your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint us a king to judge us like all the nations." Appointing a king is okay. But what the people really want to be like, we want to be like the nations. They get the upper hand because of the way they're operating with these kings. Now we know already from earlier passages of Scripture, God planned to give them a king. Remember in Deuteronomy 17, he laid out the requirements for a king. But what God wanted was a theocracy, where that king would acknowledge the Lord, and the Lord would be ruling through that king, a theocracy. What the people wanted was a monarchy. Who cares whether God is acknowledged or not? If we've got a visible king, then we can be like the other nations, and we will not be on the brunt of them controlling us. Verse 20 describes it this way: "So that we may also be like all the nations, and our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles." What happens so often is we get tempted. When life is a little bit sour for us, we see our non-Christian friends, things look so well. If only I could be like them, things would work out better. Can I just ignore God for a while? And I can be like them, and you don't see what they're really like. You just see the surface kind of stuff, and that's why it's attractive. And Samuel is really grieving over this because he's taking it personal. You're rejecting me and what I've done for you. And God speaks to Samuel on this in verse 7, and he said to Samuel, "Listen to the voice of the people regarding all that they say to you, because they have not rejected you, but they've rejected me from being king over them. Like all the deeds which they have done since the day I brought them up from Egypt, even to this day, in that they have abandoned me and served other gods, so they're doing to you as well." Some of you are taking it personally, but it's really me, the Lord is saying, that they are rejecting. And so give them a king. Now, the Lord's plan was to give them a king, but a different kind of king than what they want. So now we've transitioned. We've gone through the last two of the judges, Eli and Samuel. And now the middle part of this book in 1 Samuel, two other characters, Samuel again, but Samuel and Saul, the first king. And this part of the story is told in chapter 8 through chapter 15. According to Acts chapter 13, verse 21, Saul reigned as king for 40 years. 1050 to 1010 BC, he reigned as king. Now, Saul was not one that you would think of in terms of a choice because of the tribe that he came from. He came from Benjamin. Now, you recall the story in the book of Judges. The whole rest of the nation turned against the Benjamites because Gibeah was so morally depraved. And the Benjamites defended the Gibeonites. So the whole nation rightfully opposed Benjamin. Basically, you had one less tribe in Israel. Benjamin was left with 600 men. The whole tribe was wiped out in a civil war. And so if you're going to pick a tribe from where the first king is going to come, you pick from Judah in the south, the most dominant tribe. Or you pick Ephraim to the north, the next most dominant tribe. You don't pick Benjamin right in the middle of those two tribes. They basically were obliterated as a tribe. But yet that's God's way. So many times not doing it the way we would pick, the ones that look strong, the ones that are impressive, the ones who have so many credentials going for them, and God begins with lowly Benjamin. And so this is how it works out in terms of the first tribe sort of humbling the other tribes. In chapter 9, verse 20 and 21, when Samuel says to Saul that, "Hey, and for whom is everything that is desirable in Israel? Is it not for you and for all your father's household?" And Saul replies in that way, "Am I not a Benjamite of the smallest of the tribes of Israel? And my family the least of the families of the tribes of Benjamin?" Sometimes we think that way in terms of God using you or God using me. who am I? I don't know how God can work through me. That was the first good qualification about you. That you're not thinking, oh, I'm special. Surely God is going to use me. It begins with that humility that, who am I? And yet God delights in using people who start with that thinking of who am I? But outwardly, there were impressive things about Saul. And remember, these are a people who are looking at outward appearances. So when you look at Saul, he's a great choice, humanly speaking. Chapter 9, verse 2, he was a handsome man. And there was no one like him in terms of comparison. And from shoulders and up, he was taller than all the other people. So you want a tall man? You want a handsome man? Great choice. Saul also was quite a warrior. At the end of chapter 14, it talks about how capable he was as a fighter. And we see that there in 1 Samuel chapter 14, beginning in verse 47. Now, Saul had taken control of the kingdom over Israel. He fought against all of his enemies on every side, against Moab and the sons of Ammon, Edom, and in the whole other places that are defeated by him. So he's a good warrior. So it seems like we got a pretty impressive choice here. So the way that they go about selecting Saul the choice, first of all, it would be privately. In chapter 9, what happens is the donkeys of Saul's family, they've wandered away and they're lost. So his father sends Saul to go and try to find the donkeys, and he can't find them. And eventually they end up in Ramah, where Samuel is at, and they say, oh, there's a prophet here. Let's go and speak to this prophet about what's happened to the donkeys. Now, the day before, God had whispered in Samuel's ears, tomorrow I'm going to send you this young man, and I want you to anoint him as king. And so this conversation where who am I comes forth between Samuel and Saul. And then chapter 10, verse 1, there is a private anointing where it says Samuel took the flask of oil and poured it on Saul's head and kissed him and said, has the Lord not anointed you as ruler? At this point, he came upon Saul in a special way, rushed upon him, so he's able to do in his own timidity what he normally would not be able to do. So in verse 11, he gathers them together in 3 companies, and they came into the midst of the camp in the morning watch, and they struck and killed the Ammonites until the heat of the day, and those who survived were scattered, and no 2 of them were left together. Major accomplishment through this timid leader and king. And verses 14 and 15, there's great celebration. They come, let's go to Gilgal and renew the kingdom there. Apparently Gilgal was a place where they would report back to regularly and renew their commitment and renew the kingdom. And there's great joy in this day. They offered sacrifices of peace offerings before the Lord, and there Saul and all the men of Israel rejoiced greatly. So a great day of rejoicing with Saul as their king. But what we pick up with King Saul is that he was a man that only obeyed God when it was convenient. Have you struggled with that? Where when it's convenient for you, then you will obey God. If it's an inconvenient thing, you won't obey God. At least you won't fully obey God. And this comes out in 2 examples in Saul's life. One of them would have been early on in his experience as king. In chapter 10, verse 8, as we noticed, Samuel says to Saul, you shall go down ahead of me to Gilgal, and behold, I will come down to you to offer burnt offerings and sacrifice peace offerings. You shall wait 7 days until I come to you and inform you of what you should do. Pretty clear instructions. Wait 7 days. Well, we get to chapter 13, and the Philistines are pressing upon the Israelites. They're ready for battle. And so it says in chapter 13, verse 5, the Philistines assembled to fight with Israel. Oh, they got chariots. They got superior technology. 30,000 chariots and 6,000 horsemen, and people like the sand which is on the seashore in abundance, and they're camped at Michmash, east of Beth-aven. Well, verse 8, Saul waited most of the 7 days. Verse 8, it says he waited for 7 days until the appointed time that Samuel had set. But Samuel didn't come to Gilgal, and the people were scattering. He's losing his fighting force. They're scattering out of fear. And so what does Saul do? He takes the role as priest and offers a sacrifice. He says, bring me the burnt offering and the peace offerings, and he offered the burnt offerings. As soon as he had finished offering the burnt offering, Samuel came. And Samuel said, what have you done? And Saul said, since I saw the people scattering from me, and that you didn't come at the appointed time, the Philistines were assembled at Michmash. I thought, now the Philistines will come down against me at Gilgal, and I haven't asked for the favor of the Lord. And I worked up my courage and offered the burnt offering. Samuel said, you have acted foolishly. You have not kept the commandment of the Lord, which he commanded you. The Lord would have established your kingdom over Israel forever. You failed the test. But now your kingdom shall not endure. The Lord has sought out for himself a man after his own heart, and the Lord has appointed him as ruler over you because you have not kept the word of the Lord, what the Lord had commanded. Now there was a story early on in this book in chapter 7, verse 10, where the same thing happened. Samuel was offering a sacrifice. And while he's offering the sacrifice for the nation, the Philistines are coming to fight. And what does God do? He intervenes. It says there that God caused it to thunder, a great thunder, and that confused the Philistines. So the Israelites were able to strike them at that point. God could have done the same thing here. But what does Saul think? No, he takes the role as the priest, which God did not authorize him to do. And he also thinks, again, somehow he can control God. If I offer this sacrifice, I will control God and he will come through. Why not just wait the full 7 days? Samuel's going to come. And if the Philistines attack you even as you're offering the sacrifice, God will take care of that. He'll thunder or do something to confuse the Philistines, and you can trust him to come through, and that certainly will not take place. They won't be victorious against us. It kind of indicates where Saul is at. He's always rationalizing, always making excuses why he doesn't fully obey God, and revealing that he only obeys God when it's convenient. But when it's not convenient and he thinks otherwise, he won't obey God. The last time that this happened and recorded in the book is in chapter 15, where he really fails the test. In chapter 15, and this is drawing from something that happened 400 years earlier, the Amalekites had attacked the stragglers of Israel when they were making their way through the wilderness towards the promised land. Amalekites were a wicked people, taking advantage of anything in terms of benefit. So God says to Saul, it's time to obliterate the Amalekites. In chapter 15, the Lord of armies says, I will punish Amalek for what they did to Israel, and that he obstructed him on the way while he was coming up from Egypt. Now go and strike Amalek, completely destroy everything that he has, and do not spare him, but put to death both man and woman, child and infant, ox and sheep, camel and donkey. The judge of the earth has spoken. It's time for the Amalekites to be wiped out because of their depravity and the way they treated my people. Does Saul fully obey? Verse 8, he captured Agag, the king of the Amalekites, alive. Verse 9, Saul and the people spared Agag and the best of the sheep, the oxen, the more valuable animals, the lambs, and everything that was good, and were unwilling to destroy them completely, but everything despicable and weak they completely destroyed. Has he obeyed God? No. Verse 12, it says there that Saul set up a monument for himself. He's so impressed with himself, he sets up a monument of how he has carried out the word of the Lord. Well, when Samuel comes, he says, look, I've obeyed, I've carried out the word of the Lord. And Samuel's response is, why do I hear sheep and oxen? I shouldn't be able to hear the bleating of sheep from the Amalekites if you fully obeyed the word of the Lord. Now watch, it's not true confession yet. In verse 14 and 15, Saul said, hey, they have brought, he's passing the blame to the Israelites. They have brought from the Amalekites, or the people spared the best of the sheep and oxen to sacrifice to the Lord your God. but the rest we have completely destroyed. Verse 21, the people, again, it's the people to blame, not me. The people took some of the spoil, sheep and oxen, the choicest of the things designated for destruction, to sacrifice to the Lord your God. And then there's this memorable word from the Lord through Samuel. Does the Lord have as much delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as obeying the voice of the Lord? Behold, to obey is better than sacrifice, and to pay attention is better than the fat of rams. If you're just going to do outward things hoping that will impress the Lord, you're missing it entirely. That's not from the heart. And to obey is better than sacrifice. Finally, he makes a confession in verse 24. I have sinned, for I have violated the command of the Lord and your words, because I feared the people and listened to the voice, or their voice. You see what's going on here. It's fear of people, wanting to please people, that's driving Saul. And it's also doing stuff that's convenient for him in terms of obedience. And then it's rationalization, always making an excuse why he didn't fully obey God and passing the blame on to someone else. They did that, rather than totally confessing. A person who is after God's own heart, he fully confesses, or she fully confesses, without rationalization and without excuse. Even then, he's more concerned about how things are appearing. Notice in verse 30, Saul said, I've sinned, but please honor me now before the elders of my people and before all Israel, and go back with me so that I may worship the Lord your God. Again, more concerned about outward appearance before people than fully obeying, and brokenness over the lack of full obedience on his part. So Saul was a king that's what the people want. He's the king of what the people want, not the kind of king that God really wanted. And now we transition to the king that God really wanted. And the third group of people in this book is Saul and David. And that's 1 Samuel chapter 16 through the end of the book, where Saul and David are prominent. David also reigned for 40 years as king, beginning in 1010 BC, and 2 Samuel chapter 5. Verse 4 indicates a 40-year reign on David's part as well. And here is the man that was the man after God's own heart that Samuel talked about in chapter 13, verse 14. God's choice as king. Notice again, they don't get it at first. In chapter 16, the Lord said to Samuel, how long are you going to be mourning about Saul? I've rejected him. It's time to move onward. Sometimes we're emotionally not getting out of the past. And God is saying, get beyond it. There's been enough mourning about the heartache and the disobedience from times past. Let's move forward. I want you to anoint a new guy as king. And now go down, and I'm going to identify who this is going to be. Go to Jesse and Bethlehem, and let's get his sons gathered. Now Samuel even misses it as well. In verse 6, he sees Eliab, the first. He says, boy, this guy's impressive. Surely the anointed is standing before me. And God says in verse 7, do not look at his appearance. We've already done that as a nation. Don't look at his appearance or at the height of his stature, because I have rejected him. For God does not see as a man sees, since man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. I struggle with that all the time. I'm sure you do too. Always looking at outward appearance, always evaluating people by their outward appearance, rather than trying to see deeper than that to the heart. And then we're controlled by what impresses us or what doesn't impress us about outward appearance. Hey, David is so written off, he's not even present at this feast to be identified. He's out in the fields keeping sheep, because surely the youngest isn't going to be God's choice. Yes, it is. God's ways are different than our ways. And so then he identifies when David comes in, this is the man. Anoint him. And so he anoints him before the family. Verse 13, Samuel took the horn of oil and anointed him in the midst of his brothers. And the Spirit of the Lord rushed upon David from that day forward. The Spirit of the Lord, in contrast, in the next verse, departed from Saul. And an evil spirit from the Lord terrified him from that day onward. And so the Spirit comes, the Spirit goes. He comes rushing upon David from that day onward. He has now departed from Saul. And it will be an evil spirit from the Lord that will come upon Saul and terrorize him. Only because of his disobedience, only from turning away from the Lord does this take place. David becomes prominent before King Saul and the court and the nation for the two things that we know him best for, his worship and his fighting ability. So his worship becomes prominent, first of all. And you want to talk about the power of music? When the evil spirit would come upon Saul and he would be terrorized, his counselors say, hey, let's get a musician that would come before him, and this could calm him down when this evil spirit comes upon him. And so chapter 16, verse 23, David is first of all prominent for his worship and for his musical ability. It came about whenever the evil spirit from God came to Saul, David would take the harp and play it with his hand, and Saul would feel relieved and become well, and the evil spirit would leave him. The prominence of good Christian music today that can help you when you're down and you're low and depressed. Get some good, wholesome Christian music and listen to it and watch it lift your spirits. And David becomes risen high in terms of esteem because of his ability to do this, but also his fighting ability. In chapter 17, there's this battle that's taking place. And in those days, why waste armies in fighting and battle? You send your best champion out to the field, we'll send our best champion, and whoever wins the battle. Well, the Philistines got this guy that nobody, if you're talking about outward impression, nobody's like Goliath. The guy's almost 10 feet tall. And so he's their champion, and he comes out and he just defies Israel. And everybody's terrified. They're fearful. Every time he comes out and issues this challenge, no one will go and face this guy, including the guy who's a head and shoulder taller than everyone else in the nation, won't go out and fight this champion. David looks at the situation totally different. Everybody else just sees a giant, and they're terrified. David sees what's going on in the spiritual realm. Verse 26. What will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and rids Israel of this disgrace? For who is this uncircumcised Philistine? One who's not in a relationship with the Lord. The uncircumcised Philistine, that he has dared to defy the armies of the living God. David sees the living God is being defied here. He sees beyond a giant. He points it out to Saul too. In verse 36, your servant has killed the lion and the bear. The uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, since he has defied the armies of the living God. And David, he went in the fields taking care of sheep. I've been able to kill lions and bears. This guy will be no different than that. The Lord's going to enable me to do that kind of thing. Well, he comes before Saul with these smooth stones. And when I was in the area of the world in that Valley of Elah, I picked up some smooth stones. And I've got them in my office if you want to see. But guess what? There's nothing magical about them. They're small, smooth stones, just like any other small, smooth stones. And he goes to battle against this guy. And notice again, seeing what's happening here in verse 45, he says to Goliath, you come to me with a sword and a spear and a saber. But I come to you in the name of the Lord of armies, the God of armies of Israel, whom you've defied. This day the Lord will hand you over to me, and I will strike you and remove your head from you. Then I will give the dead bodies of the army of the Philistines this day to the birds of the sky. Why? So that all the earth may know there is a God in Israel, and that this entire assembly may know that the Lord does not save by sword or spear. For the battle is the Lord's, and he will hand you over to us. Now, you can see just giants and be fearful over giants in your life right now, or you can see beyond that to the living God and the presence of the living God in your life. And with the living God active in your life, those giants cannot stand before you. And you realize the Lord works. Why does he work? So people know he's God. And can you look at Goliath and say, I can face Goliath and operate in such a way in faith that more people will know that there is the God who is the living God that I serve, and they will be impressed with him. That's what it's all about by taking these battles in faith. Well, a great victory takes place, and the Philistines are driven out. And then there becomes this very number one on the charts, the new song in Israel in those days, is singing a song of victory. And Saul's listening as the women go out to sing, and they say, Saul, in chapter 18, verse 7, Saul has slain his thousands. Great, to Saul's ears. And David his 10,000s. Not good to this jealous king upon whom the evil spirit comes. And Saul became very angry, for this lyric displeased him. And he said, they have given David credit for 10,000s, but to me they have given credit for only thousands. Now what more can he have but the kingdom? And Saul eyed David with suspicion from that day onward. And so he begins to just oppose David with jealousy and envy in many, many different ways, trying to kill David. And you know the sad thing was? David was his greatest asset. David was his greatest supporter, and he was his greatest asset. And yet in fits of jealousy, he couldn't see otherwise than a rival king. You know, don't let jealousy control you. When it does, you're not going to see things clearly. You got to ask God to help you see it clearly, because you might be trying to fight against someone who's your greatest asset and someone who's going to be there for you in thick and thin. And he just wants to do away with Saul, or do away with David. And so in many different ways, he tries to oppose and kill David, and God delivers David in many different ways, including using Saul's son, Jonathan, to bring about deliverance. His daughter, Michal, who David marries, uses her to bring about deliverance, and a bunch of other creative ways God delivers David. Hey, don't think that God runs out of ways on how to deliver you and rescue you. He can be so creative in the way he works and sees what you're going through, and he can intervene, and you've got a new counter in terms of a charge. God can counter that and see that you are okay, and that can continue to be the case. There's a couple of times in this story where David has an opportunity to kill King Saul, once in a cave and once in a field where a deep sleep comes over Saul, and all of his army comes over him, and David has opportunity. And he even has his friends saying, hey, here's the chance to kill him. And David says, no. Out of respect that Saul is the anointed of the Lord, he will not raise his hand. He knows the respect for that position. Chapter 26, verses 10 and 11 really describe where David in his heart after the Lord is at. And he says to his friend who's telling him, here's your opportunity, let me kill Saul for you. In verse 10, David said, as the Lord lives, the Lord certainly will strike him, or his day will come that he dies, or he will go down in battle and perish. The Lord forbid that I would reach out with my hand against the Lord's anointed. And then there's a scheme to show how he could have killed Saul, but doesn't. But he has this respect for the Lord. Eventually, David grows weary. He's fleeing from Saul, and he eventually grows weary. And what he does, he escapes down into the land of the Philistines in chapter 27. And he goes to Gath and goes down to the Philistines. He stays there 1 year and 4 months. And it's a really tricky balance in his life, because he has to pretend to be fighting other people, but he's actually opposing the enemies of Israel in the southern country. And the king of Gath, a Philistine, believes that he's becoming a more and more of a loyal subject to him. And then it really becomes tricky when the battle in which Saul is going to die, the king of that Gath says, you're going to fight with me, David. You're going to be part of our troops, the Philistines, against Israel at this point. And God works in a way that he doesn't have to do that, because the other lords of the Philistines, what have you done? Here's David who's killed his 10,000s. What better way could he get back into the favor of Saul than to kill us? And so God used that to send David and his men back again home and not have to fight against his own people in that way. But what happened, though, is as they've left Ziklag, which is the territory of David where he has set up camp, the Amalekites, who shouldn't be alive at this point, if Saul had been obedient to the word of the Lord, the Amalekites wouldn't be able to do what they did. But the Amalekites raid the southern country, and they take David's wives and everything. They take it all away. And so in chapter 30, imagine you're weary from a journey and you come back and everything's taken. and your army and your people, they're mad at you. It says in verse 6, chapter 30, David was in great distress because the people spoke of stoning him. How flippant people can be, looking for someone to blame. Let's stone David, our leader, for doing this. For all the people were embittered because of their sons and daughters. And I love this verse. David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. Would you learn to do that? When you feel overwhelmed and people are just opposing you right and left, would you take extra time and strengthen yourself in the Lord your God? And now you can go back and face even your buddies and companions who want to stone you to death because they lost their wives and children. Notice what else David does. He inquires of the Lord. He will not step out on his own will. He wants the will of God even in going after the Amalekites. So verse 8, David inquired of the Lord, saying, shall I pursue the band of raiders? Will I overtake them? And God's response is, pursue, for you will certainly overtake them, and you will certainly rescue everyone. And he is successful. He goes and wipes out the Amalekites, brings all the spoils back, nothing is lost, and he can share the spoils with everybody and celebration at that point. What a contrast, though. David, the man after God's own heart, he's always inquiring of the Lord as to what God's will is. What does Saul do? He seeks guidance through a medium. He's so desperate with what's happening with the Philistines in chapter 28, he seeks a medium to be a means by which he can speak to dead Samuel about what's going to happen in this battle against the Philistines. Total contrast. One after God's own heart, always inquiring of the Lord, strengthening himself in the Lord, even at weak points when everybody seems against you and blaming you. And Saul, he seeks through occult-type practices to hear some supernatural word because that's convenient for him. That's what it's all about for him, to want to have some kind of a supernatural word in that way. You wonder when you read this second half of the book, why all these years? Why is David running from one place to the next through these years? What's happening? Why not just kill Saul quickly and then just bring David onto the throne? God was doing some phenomenal things to prepare David's character in these years to be a great king of character. So things like trust in the Lord are being developed. Things like praise and thanksgiving are being developed in David's life. In fact, I've listed there some of the Psalms that David wrote, and the headings of these Psalms tell us he wrote this during this time period. And these are the very Psalms that we go to when we're in great distress. And we find great help in these Psalms in these times of distress. He learned patience. Having to wait on the Lord. He learned loyalty. He learned how to deal with betrayal. He learned respect and acknowledging the Lord's authority in a respectful way. And he learned self-control in these times. So great things were being formed in David. Don't think that there are periods in your life that are just a waste where nothing seems to be happening. These could be seasons of time when God is forming great character if you're cooperating in your life, great spiritual character and Christ-likeness by letting these years drag on. And that's what's happening inside of David and in his relationships with people. Well, Saul is killed in battle. And remember, the people were thinking, if only we had a king like the other nations, everything would be great. The truth is, after Saul was killed in battle, the nation was worse off than before Saul. They're more vulnerable than they were before having Saul. In chapter 31, verse 7, it says, now when the people of Israel who were on the other side of the valley, with those who were beyond the Jordan, saw the men of Israel had fled, and that Saul and his sons were dead, they abandoned the cities and fled. And the Philistines came and settled in them. So in the heartland of the northern part of their country, the Philistines now occupy. worse off than you were before your first king. Be careful what you demand in terms of if only we had this like other people, everything would be much different. Sometimes you have to learn the lessons the hard way, but don't be one that has to learn the real answer the hard way. Learn it up front. Do it God's way, and don't learn it the hard way otherwise. Well, David is going to step into a very messy, unstable situation where the collapse of the country, they're on the brink of the collapse of the country. We'll pick up with that next time in our next stop in our journey. Let's pray. Thank you, Father, for the many lessons